All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the latest iteration of our Florida Talks at Home series. My name is Keith Simmons. I'm the Communications Director at Florida Humanities, and we're excited to bring this program to you tonight with Mallory O'Connor talking about Mark Catesby, a naturalist that explored Florida before William Bartram. Now, normally, Florida Humanities works with cultural partners across the state to put on programs like this one in person. But obviously, that can't happen right now. Our goal in this Florida Talks at Home series is to make this virtual series a regular event until we can begin to convene in person once again. The next iteration of our Florida Talks at Home series is Made in Florida. It's about the artists, celebrities, activists, educators, and other icons from the Sunshine State. That program is going to take place on Wednesday, December 2nd at 6 p.m. You can register for that program by going to our website, floridahumanities.org/events. At the end of tonight's presentation, you will receive a short feedback survey in your email. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to fill out that survey for us. Let us know how you enjoyed the program and let us know ways that we can improve the program for next time. We also ask that if you have any questions or anything like that, you can type them into the chat bar that's to the right of your screen. Your support, by the way, is essential to helping to sustain these programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we ask that you consider visiting floridahumanities.org/support to contribute to our organization. That's so that we can continue to bring these programs to audiences like yours every single week. And so tonight, we're happy to welcome Mallory O'Connor. She's a writer, an art historian, and a musician. For 20 years, she taught art history at the University of Florida and at Santa Fe College. During that time, Mallory also wrote hundreds of magazine articles and critical essays and curated numerous exhibitions for museums and galleries. She's the author of two nonfiction books, Lost Cities of the Ancient Southeast and Florida's American Heritage River, both of which were published by the University Press of Florida. And with all that, we're now going to welcome Mallory O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Keith. And thanks to the Florida Humanities Council, they have been really wonderful in supporting my work over a number of years. And I am very appreciative of all that they've done for me and all that they've done for the people of Florida in order to bring them a wonderful series of different lectures and programs and providing grants for worthy projects that I just can't say enough good things about the Florida Humanities Council. So you might want to explore ways in which you can take full advantage of all the great things that they offer. Before I get started on my topic this evening, which is Before Bartram, Mark Catesby in La Florida, I do want to mention that a lot of the material that I'm going to be using in this lecture comes from an article in a book called Field of Vision. It was published in 2010 by the University of Alabama Press, and it contains a number of articles and essays on William Bartram and related stories about the exploration of Florida. And I co-authored a chapter in that book, Before Bartram, Mark Catesby in La Florida, with my colleague and dear friend, Arlene Fradkin, Dr. Arlene Fradkin, who was on the faculty of the Florida Atlantic University. I am very, very sorry to say that Dr. Fradkin passed away last month unexpectedly. And so I really want to dedicate my lecture this evening to Arlene Fradkin. We had some wonderful, wonderful times together, and writing this essay together was definitely one of them. Well, 62 years before William Bartram stood at the edge of what he called the great Alachua Savannah, and here it is, we now know it as Payne's Prairie, and looked out on his level green plain, the English naturalist Mark Catesby embarked on his own journey of discovery. And a lot of people know about Bartram, not so many know about Mr. Catesby. So we're going to talk this evening about Mark Catesby and his impact and compare him to what Bartram did and said and their legacies. During his first trip, which was 1712 to 1719, Catesby was a casual observer. He had come to America to visit his sister, who was married to an American, and he looked around and was very impressed and interested in what he saw. For the second trip, 1722 to 26, however, Catesby came as a commissioned scientific researcher and painter with the express purpose of observing, collecting plant and animal specimens, and visually documenting the native flora and fauna of the southern colonies. There was a great deal of interest in Europe at the time about what the heck was in the Southeast. They had the Spanish versions of what they had encountered in the Southeast, in La Florida. And La Florida wasn't just what we know of Florida today. It also included Georgia, South Carolina, a much larger swath of territory. So when we say La Florida, we're not just talking about Florida. But in any event, Catesby came as a commissioned researcher, and the result of his efforts were 263, get your head around that number, 263 watercolors and drawings. And along with field notes and hundreds of preserved specimens, Catesby's work constituted one of the earliest and certainly one of the most comprehensive systematic studies of flora and fauna in southeastern North America. His illustrations and his notes that he gathered during that period became the basis for a publication that he did called The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands. William Bartram was only one of many people who used Catesby's work as a reference and to get some idea of what it was that was down here in the southern colonies, what was useful, what was just wonderful, and how you could get to know more about it. It was Catesby's work was published in 1729 to 1747. Now that sounds weird. Why doesn't it just have a publication date? But it was a 2-volume work. Usually in those times, a book was not published in one piece. It was published by subscriptions, and it was put out a little bit at a time to people who subscribed to the publication process. So it took, as you could say, almost 20 years for The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands to be published. So it was over a period of time. And it earned him membership in the Royal Society of London, and also a very respected place in the history of natural science. Here are 3 of Catesby's watercolors, and we'll get back to more of his work later, but the ivory-billed woodpecker, the gray fox, and Catesby's lily, one of the botanical wonders that was actually named after Mr. Catesby. I'll get back to that later also. Here is a facsimile. Actually, I think this is one of the original editions, at least part of it, of Mr. Catesby's book of the history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands. Florida, more Carolina and the Bahama Islands than Florida, as we shall see. Cromwell Mortimer, who you see here, was secretary of the Royal Society, and he praised Catesby's publication as the most magnificent work I know since the art of printing has been discovered. Pretty good review, huh? The Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus used the book to develop his revolutionary classification of the various species, and Thomas Jefferson eagerly sought a copy of Natural History. He was very interested in the book himself, and of course, Jefferson was a great naturalist in his own right. My objective in this lecture is to draw parallels between William Bartram and his predecessor, Mark Catesby, and establish a historical and a cultural context for understanding and appreciating the work of both of these wonderful naturalists. In order to concentrate or to accomplish that goal, I want to concentrate on 5 particular aspects of the story: the men themselves and the context in which they worked, the route that they took to travel around the Southeast, their mentors who put up the money to launch these travels, the techniques and materials that they used, and then Bartram and Catesby's legacy in light of today's environmental issues and concerns, because they were a couple of the first people to really explore the wonders of nature and to see them just as that, not just something that could be used in some practical matter, but just as wonderful things in their own right. And John and William Bartram pored over Catesby's magnum opus before embarking on their own travels in the Southeast. Just a little going over the things I wanted to particularly cover. Mark Catesby was born in 1682, died in 1749. He was born in England and raised in the town of Sudbury in Suffolk, East Anglia, a rural section of eastern England. He was the youngest son and the 4th of 5 surviving children of Elizabeth Jekyll and John Catesby. His father, John Catesby, was a prosperous lawyer and a well-known politician in the area. Catesby probably received an informal education. You didn't have, a lot of opportunities for public education in those days, but he had an uncle, Nicholas Jekyll, his mother's brother, who maintained a botanical garden. And so he worked with his uncle, learning about different plants, and he had additional training in natural history from Jekyll's friend, the eminent English naturalist John Ray, who lived nearby. So that was lucky for young Catesby to be growing up in this kind of place where he had access to people who were well known in the area for their botanical knowledge. Also, there was an apothecary and physician and botanist, Samuel Dale, who would become a lifelong mentor and friend and would eventually introduce Catesby to London's community, very active community of botanists and horticulturalists. Now, what about young William Bartram? He had formal schooling. He learned botany from his father, though, who instilled in him at a very young age an intense love for the wilderness and for the wonders of nature. And William was also encouraged by his father's good friends, Benjamin Franklin, Cadwallader Colden, and John Gardner. In addition, William was inspired by his tutor, Charles Thomson, later Secretary of the Continental Congress, who introduced him to William Hogarth's analysis of beauty and Edmund Burke's aesthetics of the sublime, a way of seeing nature that John Bartram never really possessed, because we're at the sort of the parting of the ways here from the very strictly earlier period of Enlightenment into the Romantic period, which had a whole different kind of concept of nature as the beautiful and the sublime. This was going to lead to the Romantic movement eventually, both in Europe and in the United States. William later became acquainted with Charles Willson Peale, who you see here, lifting the curtain on the museum that he established in Philadelphia, and also Alexander Wilson, who was an artist-naturalist. Both of these gentlemen made great contributions to natural history. William was less than a year old when, in 1739, his father, John Bartram, began a correspondence with the English naturalist Mark Catesby. And for many years, John and Mark Catesby were aware of each other, were aware of each other's work, and were engaged with each other. At that time, Catesby was really working on the production of his publication, and he was depending upon a mutual friend of John's and his, Peter Collinson. Who was an English Quaker textile merchant and an avid collector of exotic plants. And he became a kind of go-between between Catesby and the Bartrams. Catesby later proposed that in exchange for providing plant and animal specimens, he would send John Bartram sections of his book as they were published from year to year. As I said, they came out on a yearly basis and you had to subscribe. But he said that they could do a trade-off. John Bartram would send him plants and animal specimens, and he would send John sections of his book. Bartram responded with a letter accepting the proposal, saying, "I am exceedingly pleased with thy proposals, and shall do what I can conveniently to comply with them. I have a great value for thy book, and esteem them as much as an excellent performance and as an ornament for the finest libraries in the world." So high praise from Mr. Bartram. Now, young William grew up in a household where the glories of nature were the topics of lively conversations and where letters frequently arrived from the most esteemed naturalists of the day, Carl Linnaeus, Peter Collinson, Johann Gronovius, Benjamin Franklin, and others of similar standing. Francis Harper, in his introduction to his annotated version of Bartram's Travels, the book that Bartram wrote after traveling extensively in the Southeast, said, "There was no more likely source of William's inspiration than Catesby's Natural History, which had been presented to John Bartram by the author himself. As a boy, William must have felt an urge to emulate Catesby in preparing his own work." So although John Bartram never received the entirety of Catesby's book, he did get enough examples to provide William with a source of study and an opportunity to see Catesby's work when he and his father visited John's circle of friends who had copies of the Natural History, including Benjamin Franklin. By the time he was 14, William was already making skillful drawings of birds and other nature subjects. In this figure, you see one of his paintings, or drawings actually, that he did when he was about 14. Really pretty good. And as you can see, he's already considering the bird in its natural habitat. That was something he picked up on very early. And Catesby also had tried to picture his subjects in their natural surroundings. It's the kind of beginning of the idea of an ecosystem that includes not only the subject itself, but also what did it eat, where did it live, what other kinds of plants and animals were around. His father, John, called William, quote, "my little botanist," and sent several examples of William's work to his colleague Peter Collinson in England. And the English collector responded with, quote, "a little token for Billy, whose pretty performances please me very much." Now, we don't know what the little token was. I don't know what he sent him. I'd love to know. What did he send? Was it, candy? Was it money? Was it maybe a picture of some kind? A paintbrush? Who knows what Collinson sent to little Billy for his wonderful performances. Now, in comparing the work of young William with that of Catesby, William's father was quick to point out that William's performances were more true to life. In a letter to Peter Collinson dated 1753, John comments that during a trip to the Jersey side of the Delaware River, he says, "My son William spied a large rattlesnake coiled up. I wished that he had brought his box of paints with him to have drawn him in his greatest beauty, for he was a yellow one, such as Catesby drew. But I believe he drew him dead. But we could not make him offer to bite, so we mercifully let him go." So here's Catesby on the right and Bartram on the left. And Bartram has this wonderful rattlesnake. He was kind of scared of rattlesnakes, but Anyway, he liked to get a good handle on how to make the best drawing of one. As artists, both Bartram and Catesby were largely self-taught. Bartram left a detailed journal with numerous writings, and there is a well-known portrait of Bartram by Charles Willson Peale. On the other hand, Catesby left no journal. We don't really know, except for the notes that he made, what else he explored or what else he thought about it. Here are some of Catesby's other drawings, though. His kingfisher, his flamingo, and a rice bird with a little frog. Bartram and Catesby both traveled extensively throughout parts of the southern colonies, each making 2 extended trips to the area. Catesby got his first glimpse of the American colonies in 1712 when he accompanied his sister Elizabeth to Williamsburg, Virginia, where he stayed with her and her husband, Dr. William Koch, a successful physician. Catesby remained in Williamsburg for 7 years, casually observing flora and fauna and visiting with the gentlemen planters. He explored the plantation fields, he collected specimens, he sent them home to some of his friends in England, particularly Samuel Dale, and he did a number of drawings of plants and animals that he saw. He also had an opportunity to travel to Jamaica during this time, where he pursued the natural resources of the West Indies. By the time he returned to England in 1719, he was known in the scientific community as that curious botanist for his abilities as a botanical collector. Here's a map that shows, a map from the Times actually, that gives you an idea of the territory that Catesby was traveling in. The Carolinas, didn't really get that much into Florida, then went down to the Caribbean and explored around there, did a number of drawings and notes and included those in his book. A group of scientifically minded men in South Carolina, the newly appointed royal governor, Francis Nicholson, you see here, eminent botanist William Sherard, and physician and naturalist and later founder of the British Museum, Sir Hans Sloane. And they all pledged funds to sponsor Catesby to undertake a second trip to North America. Catesby was to conduct a systematic study of the colonial Southeast, and eventually the circle of Catesby's supporters and advisors widened to include colonists in North America. Let me go back to that earlier. We'll get back to Bartram in a minute. But John Bartram was included in this group of prominent naturalists. Even though Catesby's book was titled The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, the geographic range in the title exceeds that of the actual journey. Florida was not part of Catesby's itinerary. They think that he got as far as the St. Mary's River, that he did not cross it into the Florida territory. In January 1725, he left for the Bahamas, where he visited the islands of Andros, Abaco, and Eleutheria, returned to England in 1726. Bartram first experienced the southern colonies in 1765, so quite a while later, when he accompanied his father, John Bartram, on one of his collecting expeditions. After having sailed from Philadelphia to Charlestown, South Carolina, they traveled overland through Georgia to northeast Florida, where they explored the St. Johns River. Here you see a map that Bartram drew of the east coast of Georgia and Florida. Over on the right, you see the map that shows exactly what the trail was that Bartram followed from down to Charleston, South Carolina, down into Florida, and later over into Georgia, into North Carolina, actually, and over through Alabama and Mississippi to the Mississippi River. So Bartram made a much more extensive tour of the Southeast. Accompanying his father, Bartram observed the natural history of the area. He was still a very young man at the time. They explored. He helped his father collect plants and did some drawings. But for his second journey, which lasted 4 years, 1773 to 77, you'll notice that that surrounds the time of the Revolutionary War. And Bartram would have been in kind of an interesting position had he been in Philadelphia, because his father, of course, had worked for the king, and there was some concern about loyalties in terms of the Bartram family, although John Bartram managed to land on the right side of that argument. But when Bartram embarked on his own expedition, he was still commissioned by his chief patron, Dr. John Fothergill, back in England. And his assignment was to collect specimens, to make drawings of the plants he encountered, and to send all of these back to Fothergill. He retraced the route previously taken by him and his father on his second journey, and then traveled, as I mentioned, through North and South Carolina, Georgia, East and West Florida. It's wonderful. You can see these Bartram trail markers, which I show you here, all over the place. The Bartram Trail Society has done a great job of documenting this amazing journey. And up in North Carolina, where we own some property near Highlands, North Carolina, and right down the street from where that property is one of William Bartram's trail markers, because he was up there too, and talking about the entire area. He ventured west over the Appalachian Mountains into Cherokee country, traveled through what is now Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, visited the Creek and Choctaw Indians, sailed along the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, he really, really made an amazing adventure. In their travels, both men were interested in new plants and animals, and diligently recorded the species they encountered. Bartram was always looking for new species. He really was interested in things that were previously unknown to science and had never been named before. So here is his Franklinia altamaha that he had encountered. He thought it was a beautiful plant, and related to the Magnolia grandiflora, and he named it after his friend and mentor, Benjamin Franklin. So the Franklinia altamaha. He also often used Indian names when he encountered a species he hadn't seen before. The Seminole Creek name for the sandhill crane was the Watula. And so Bartram used that name when he labeled some of his drawings of sandhill cranes. Now, Catesby was looking to discover New World species that were not known in the Old World, that were new to European naturalists. So here is a couple of the things that he found: the blue jay and the bullfrog that hadn't been seen in Europe, at least not in exactly the same way. Of modest means, both Bartram and Catesby relied on funds supplied by their patrons to undertake the tasks at hand and to meet the expectations of their sponsors. Bartram and Catesby sent back natural specimens and notes on their observations. Peter Collinson, as you see, well, here's John Fothergill. Peter Collinson was a middleman, and John Fothergill was a gardener. He was one of William's main sponsors, but also Margaret Cavendish Bentinck, the Duchess of Portland, who was an important benefactor. In 1722, Catesby embarked for Charlestown, South Carolina, also Bartram's base. And Bartram was 34 years old when he went on his second expedition, but Catesby was 43, a kind of late bloomer, began this adventure. Here are some of the products of his works. And you see one of the things he tried to do, again, as Bartram did, was to put his specimens in context. He wanted to show what they ate, what they lived on, what they were all about, really. And so, his fish, he tried to catch them, bring them up on like a deck or something where he could capture them before the air faded their colors. So he gets some really wonderful images of his flora and fauna. Both Catesby and Bartram did their fieldwork under very trying circumstances, you can imagine, tramping through the southern wilderness faced with obstacles. Bartram wrote about encountering alligators, and you can see his drawing of the alligators here. I think they look like dinosaurs to me, but that's all right. Whatever, Bartram has wonderful things to say about these oddities that he encountered. And Catesby mentioned poisonous snakes, the rattlesnake. He was really afraid of rattlesnakes. And the weather conditions he had to work under, chronic lack of supplies necessary to conduct his work. So they both had lots of problems. And they also complained about their patrons, even though they knew they had, they relied on their money for their work. But Fothergill became annoyed at the delay in receiving shipments. There wasn't much they could do about that. Catesby's patrons also complained. Dried plants, molded animal specimens were packed into wide-mouthed jars and filled with rum as a preservative. But guess what? They were put on boats. They were shipped to England. And the sailors on board found a wonderful way of having a drink of rum. Just empty out specimen bottles. And some of them didn't arrive in very good shape. So it was kind of touch and go in terms of getting these specimens back to England. Regarding techniques, both artists were essentially self-taught. Catesby combined drawing of individual animals and plants together in the same plate, showing environmental associations. He often pictured birds with the plants on which they fed. Whenever possible, he drew his subjects directly from life. Now, later on, there were artist-naturalists like Audubon, for example, that shot their subjects so that they would be able to spend more time detailing, every feather and so on. But Catesby and Bartram both wanted to draw directly from life and to not take the life of their subject, you might say. Here's some of Bartram's works. Bartram's Magnolia Warbler, again pictured in a context, the Little Green Bittern from 1775. There were no art schools in America until the early 1800s, when the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts was established. So Bartram's early work was imitative of Catesby's. He also apparently was given some instruction by a Swedish portrait painter, Gustavus Cecilius. Bartram's later work is more refined, and the subjects are a little bit more natural. Most of Catesby's works, let me go back for a minute. Most of Catesby's works are in the British Museum. Most of Bartram's works, are in the British Museum. And also there is a body of them in the American Philosophical Society collection in Philadelphia. But most of Catesby's original works can be found in the Royal Library of Windsor Castle in England. And it was fairly recently, a few years ago, a museum in Savannah did a exhibition of the watercolors from the Windsor Castle collection. It was absolutely a treat to go up and see these original watercolors from Catesby's, journeys. And it was also sort of fun that when you read the labels, it told you about the particular work and what it represented and so on. And then down at the bottom, it said, by courtesy of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. So you knew that these objects from the Windsor collection were coming straight from the Queen herself. Now, both Catesby and Bartram were pioneers in the field of scientific exploration. They became members of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. Bartram did in the American Philosophical Society. Catesby was inducted into the Royal Society of London in 1733. This was a time when science and art really overlapped. And their travels, Bartram's travels and Catesby's natural history, were really models of the spirit of scientific inquiry at the time. They left an incredibly rich legacy. They, both of them had species that were named after them. Here we have a species named for Bartram, Bartram's plover, and Catesby's lily. A number of Bartram's works also had to do with the Indians. He was incredibly interested in both depicting and understanding the culture of the Southeast Indian tribes. And his descriptions are among the best Indian studies of that time period. Now, as a Quaker, Bartram believed in the worth of all creation, regardless, Indians, whites, the Quaker tradition for tolerance and pacifism. In addition, Bartram valued the Indian knowledge of plants. In fact, Cowkeeper, the head of the Seminole group that he encountered in this area of Florida, in north central Florida, gave him the nickname of the flower hunter. And so that was something that Bartram, kind of forged a real bond with the Indians. And he's still, really known today. His travels, in fact, the frontispiece was a portrait that he made of a Creek Indian in Florida. Bartram's Travels was first published in Philadelphia and subsequently then published in London and in other parts of Europe. It received a respectful reception in America, but it fared much better in Europe. People were crazy to know about the New World, about the South, Southern colonies, and it was translated into Dutch and German and French within a decade, and a total of 9 foreign editions were printed. And his observations on the Creek and Cherokee Indians was also published in 1853 posthumously, and is a rich source of ethnographic information still today. Some of the species that Catesby painted and described, such as the passenger pigeon, which you see here, and the Carolina parakeet, as he called them, are now both extinct. So part of their work was really in terms of documenting species in the wild that no longer are there. The ivory-billed woodpecker is almost extinct now. Only a few survive in isolated parts of Louisiana and Florida. And likewise, the Franklinia shrub that I showed you earlier that Bartram discovered in Georgia doesn't occur in the wild today. So they captured a world that no longer exists. And that, I think, in itself is really a monumental legacy. Ashton Nichols, in his book, Romantic Natural Histories, writes, romantic natural histories link animated nature with what Samuel Taylor Coleridge called the one life within us and abroad. And Charles Darwin would later describe the same idea by saying that all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth may be descended from one primordial form. Coleridge was very influenced by Bartram's writings, especially his descriptions of the springs and the geyser kinds of eruptions of spring waters and the odd underground rivers. This was just an amazing concept. How would you write about it? Coleridge wrote in his poem, Xanadu, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Think about it. He's describing these wonderful outpourings of water, their paths in the rivers, and then the rivers go underground. And what do they feed? They feed that sea of the Floridan aquifer. caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. It all just fits together. It's beautiful. I love Coleridge's poetry. What I think is new by 1790 was a sense that these were not just rhetorical comparisons of behavior between human and animal realms, but that they were observationally supported by reflected in a deeper organic quality that was shared by all living things. Nichols concludes that William Bartram had perhaps as much impact on romantic writers as any other 18th century naturalist, and he also had an impact on the development of romantic art in this country and in Europe. The whole Romantic era of the 1800s was highly influenced by some of Bartram's writings and other naturalists who were working at the time. He really contributed to stimulating the European imagination over a number of years, and an influence that lasted for quite a long time. Catesby considered his images of the flora and fauna of the southern wilderness more important than his written descriptions. So he didn't spend a lot of time on his writings. They were kind of notes. His paintings are simply beautiful and charming works of art. But his illustrations are so much more than an observation. His plants and animals are not static. They're captured in motion, doing what they ordinarily do, full of vitality. Here we see a green tree frog perched on a skunk cabbage. It has its mouth open. It's too small, I think, for you to see in the image here, but he has his mouth open and the tongue extending upward toward an unsuspecting spider up at the top of the leaf. And over on the left, we find a buffalo that's dwarfed by a locust scratching himself against the broken trunk of a tree. So these are very witty, whimsical views of nature, very beautifully conceived and presented to us here from both of these artists-naturalists. Here's the map that Bartram drew of his great Alachua Savannah. We can see the Alachua sink over at the top left corner. Some of the different birds that he admired here, the different kinds of trees, and what we all see, you know, spring and fall around here, this part of Florida, the sandhill cranes. And he spent quite a lot of time talking about the sonorous sandhill cranes and that wonderful call that they give. Well, for both Catesby and Bartram, the natural world was their subject, and they portrayed colonial America as they saw it: fascinating, beautiful, alluring, mysterious. They captured their enthusiasm and awe on canvas and in words, and indeed their greatest gift has been in directing subsequent generations to find that pleasure and awe in nature, because the Romantic movement in writing, in art, even in science, directed our attention to the interconnectedness of all things, to the ecosystems which we need in order to survive, to the relationships in nature that we find. And people like Thoreau and so on were very influenced by this, and environmental activists, people involved in ecology and in the ecological movements, even if they don't realize it, are influenced by these early people who looked and saw and told us what they saw. Okay, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to listen to them and try to answer.
Thanks so much, Mallory, I think, for that really fascinating presentation and a lot of the insight that you provided about the way people have explored and ultimately come to understand Florida, even sort of in the early phases of European settlement. So there are a couple questions that I certainly have. And again, for anyone in our audience, if you have any questions, type them down into the chat and we'll try to work as many of them as possible into our conversation this evening. I think the first two questions I want to ask are some that our audience members raised that might provide a little bit of clarity or some additional information about Catesby. And so I think the first question is, can you clarify or provide some more information about what was Catesby's background? I mean, was it sort of this formal training as a naturalist? Was it a botanist? Was it typical in terms of someone who pursues being a naturalist as a profession?
Catesby and Bartram both are products of their times. And so they started out at a very local level. They learned from parents or from friends of their parents or from people in the area that they could interact with. They didn't really have much formal training. Bartram had more formal training than Catesby did. But, both of them really were self-taught in that sense. And then, of course, later, when they became acquainted with other people in their, like Bartram's father's network of people who were members of the Royal Society and so on, then their horizons expanded considerably. And they were able to really get a much greater appreciation of the science and see other people's work and hear from other people and be able to compare what they were doing with other scientists and naturalists at the time. But things were, there weren't the opportunities to go off and necessarily study at Oxford or or Harvard or something. So you made the best you could of what you had. And it was just a good thing that both of them had parents who encouraged their talent and gave them materials and tried to find teachers for them and introduced them to other people that were interested in the same kinds of things.
And so you talk about that importance of network in terms of the way that Catesby and Bartram first learned how to essentially do the things that they do. So one of the other questions that was asked is about Catesby and his mother, and wondering if there's any connection or any relation to Gertrude Jekyll, who was a horticulturalist and a garden designer. Do you know of any connection there?
I haven't come across anything in particular, but and there certainly could be other surnames, Jekyll, but I do know that his mother's brother, Catesby's uncle, was very involved in horticulture. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there were other members of the family that were, but I can't say for sure.
Okay. I wonder if we could then just take a step back and talk about a naturalist as a whole. We were discussing this a little bit before we came on the air that when it comes to being a naturalist, there's certainly an art side when it comes to the documentation and the illustrations that are created. And then there's also a science side and capturing a lot of notes and information there. Do you feel like, and in particular, you're talking about, our interest is certainly the humanities, but do you feel like one aspect of that naturalist discipline, the art side or the science side, is there one that tends to matter a little bit more? Are they co-equal in terms of their importance? What's your perspective on that?
I think that if you look at the time frame, and a lot of times we're dealing with things that hadn't been seen before, I think there was a natural curiosity. Both Catesby and Bartram were very curious about the natural world. They explored the natural world. They were fascinated with anything they hadn't seen before, and they just made pictures of it. As I mentioned to you earlier, Keith, they didn't have a camera, so they had to draw something. They couldn't take a camera with them. So they had to make an image of it so they could remember it as clearly as possible. And so the idea of art and science and studying the natural world and understanding it and finding out about it and exploring it went hand in hand. There was no way to separate the two. And I mentioned to you, as a child, that's kind of what I did too. I was always out in the garden with my notebook and making sketches of plants and writing notes about them. And I would do that when we went on camping trips. and save specimens. And I didn't know that's what I was doing at the time. It was just a sort of natural curiosity. And I think in both cases, their curiosity led them to these explorations, and then they wanted to document them so that they wouldn't forget them and so they could later pass them on to other people.
Right. And when you talk about, sort of your initial interest in art and some of those things that you did as a child, I mean, do you feel like have you done any work that you feel like is similar to a naturalist, after you've studied art and that sort of thing? Like, have you done like maybe expeditions sort of on your own to different parts of the state or parts of the country and sort of practice this idea of being a naturalist?
I got more involved really in a kind of wider culture. So my travel journals are full of pictures, but often they're pictures of a cathedral that I was looking at, or maybe an artifact that I saw in a museum and I wanted to make a picture of it. I illustrate all my travel journals, but a lot of my travels were more to European sites, and not necessarily looking at botanical imagery. I was really intrigued, though, with one sort of sub area of that, and that was when I was doing a lot of work on women's art and women's art history. It was very interesting to look at how many women were involved in botanical illustration, or who were involved in utilizing things like images of flowers or fauna, flora and fauna on china, or something that, these were women's art forms that they were allowed to pursue in, say, the 1800s, for example, or earlier. And so a lot of women's art, curiously enough, seemed to grow out of this naturalist predilection.
That's interesting. I didn't really realize that there's some of that intersection there in terms of women being able to pursue that and turning it into a lot of other different opportunities in terms of China and things like that. Um, do we see in some of these expeditions and explorations, are women involved in helping Catesby and Bartram or maybe other naturalists in terms of helping to document some of the species that are found and in that capacity?
Well, there were patrons, of course, like the Duchess, that provided money, and other people in the upper echelon of society that collected their work or subscribed to their work. But on the ground, I think probably there could have been particularly some interaction with Indians, because a lot of times women were herbalists in Indian cultures, and they were in colonial culture as well, and might be familiar with plants that other people didn't know about. And so I think probably in that respect they did contribute to the overall knowledge that Bartram and Catesby had.
And it looks like we have a question from one of our audience members that focuses more on something that you mentioned in your presentation about some of the animal and plant species that are documented and studied by Catesby are now extinct or they're no longer in the wild. So, do you have any suggestions for if someone's curious about identifying those particular species? Is there a way for someone to identify that information?
Well, that's a good one. I think you're gonna stump me there, except that I know there probably, I haven't explored them exactly, but there probably are scholars who are working on documenting extinct species. I would just see if you can, follow up on that. I see who's writing on that these days. I haven't got a particular author or scholar to direct you to, but I'm sure there are people who are dealing with that topic. Um, I don't know. Ask Uncle Google.
That's always certainly a great option. And like I said, it's just sort of a curiosity about the way that we can kind of understand, Florida's natural environment. And I think particularly as we talked about, you have this growing sense of development, and you also have challenges related to climate change. That
Yeah.
there's this constant sort of impact on our environment, and so it's just wanting to have insight on that.
Right.
Something else that we also talked about sort of before we came on the air is that, I had this question about how does Florida figure in naturalists wanting to do expeditions? How does Florida sort of figure into all of the possible places that a naturalist might go? Was it sort of a top destination, or and also what were some of the motivations for someone like Catesby or Bartram to explore Florida? I think you might have mentioned it in your presentation that it really was sort of driven by the interests of the British Crown to certainly start some of those expeditions.
Absolutely. Well, I think starting with the very earliest idea of the New World, and you go back and you want to look at Columbus, and you want to look at some of the very early explorers who encountered this continent. Uh, People in Europe were absolutely, just thrilled to find out any information they possibly could. So the idea of artist-naturalist really goes back into the certainly into the 1500s. There was several people who accompanied explorers on expeditions, and like Theodore de Bry, and went on the René Ladonnière expedition to Florida, the Spanish expedition, or French expedition, excuse me, that landed close to where Jacksonville is now, and explored the area. And Lemoyne made numerous drawings of the people and things that he encountered, the landscapes, the Indians, and so on. So there was a long history for at least several centuries of people being enthralled with the secrets of the New World. And so there was especially in Europe, I think, an audience for anything having to do with the New World and its exotic wonders that nobody had seen locally there, certainly. And in this country, as I mentioned, after after the colonies got Florida from the Spanish, they couldn't wait to get down here and find out what kind of resources might be available in this area. And then it went on from there. Florida became a tourist destination after the Civil War. People wanted to come down and see for themselves. And then there was a whole spa culture that grew up around Florida's springs, because that was very popular in Europe at the time. So, and a lot of these people also took notes, wrote letters, told people about what they found, what they saw, what they encountered. They were fascinated. So, yeah, Florida has until it became kind of so popular it was overrun with tourists. And there was nothing more exotic to be found than the Days Inn. It had definitely that reputation, and I think still does in terms of some of the magical wonders of like the springs and so on that we haven't managed to overwhelm yet.
Right, and that kind of leads to another question I had that you're kind of just talking about in terms of becoming overwhelmed with people in some parts of the state, which certainly can complicate things from an environmental perspective. But it does seem like there's really a lot that we can learn from studying, naturalists and really just sort of their fascination and their interest in the natural environment. And so I was just wondering if that's sort of a statement or a notion that you would agree with.
Absolutely. I think that we look at people like Bartram, like Catesby, like Audubon, who had the privilege, you might say, of seeing the natural world before it was kind of trampled over, and recording what they saw and finding in it such a wellspring of awe and wonder. I remember we used to go camping, and I grew up in Northern California, and we went camping up in the Sierras almost every weekend. My father was a great trout fisherman. And so we explored all over the place. And when I first started going up there, I won't tell you how many years ago, you could still drink the water right out of the stream. There was no pollution. There was nothing up there. And I remember the first time we went up camping, I must have been about 15 or so, where the streams were posted that the water was not safe to drink. And my mother burst into tears. She was just devastated. It was like, oh no, look what they've done. And I think there's that feeling, of these guys saw this before any of this degradation happened. And how fortunate that we can at least read their descriptions of what the world once was before there was so much environmental degradation.
Absolutely, and I think it is really one of the only ways that we can capture the way that our state was sort of in this moment in time is by really sort of getting an appreciation for their works. And one last question I wanted to ask you before we sort of wrapped up for the evening is we were talking again before we sort of came on the air about how COVID has been an interesting time. It seems like it's something that's sort of been going on for uh,
Forever.
who knows how long, really, at this point, right? But just curious if you are currently working on any new projects or any projects sort of in general.
Well, I mentioned to you, Keith, that my husband's an artist, and we've used this opportunity of extra time on our hands, so to speak, to collaborate on a cookbook that's also a memoir, and that my husband is illustrating the recipes with original pastel artworks. So we're doing a cookbook, memoir, art book, love story. And the other thing, though, that people might find of interest is that the Matheson History Museum here in Gainesville has put together an archive of experiences of the pandemic from people in this community. And if you are interested in seeing that, you can go to mathesonhistorymuseum.org. That's their website, and click on archive, and you can see what people sent in by way of letters and essays and personal responses and photographs and creative work. It's really intriguing. And the Writers Alliance of Gainesville is now collaborating with the Matheson to make this into a publication, a book that will document one community's response to COVID. I'm sure there are a lot of communities doing this, but this is, we've gotten very serious about it. We have about 85 entries. We have a lot of images, photos, paintings, and so on. And we have a publisher now, so that book should be out probably sometime in the spring, April, May, something like that.
I mean, that's a lot of really exciting projects, and certainly it's important to document, what's going on from a community's perspective, but also in a personal way. And so I
Yeah.
think, we certainly look forward to your cookbook slash love story to be published, as soon as possible, so we can hopefully have a conversation about your conversation about food and how it's sort of been connected to you and your family. So, again, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us this evening about Catesby, Bartram, and really just all this fascinating information about Florida's natural environment. And just want to thank our audience again for joining us this evening for this program. We certainly look forward to seeing you at our next program, which will be December 2nd on Made in Florida. And so until then, thanks so much, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you so much for everybody. I really appreciate it. Thanks for being here.